Well, at this point, I would like to invite our speaker for today, the man who needs no introduction, really, Dane Starbuck. What can I tell? Rhodes Scholar, musician, author, historian, practicing lawyer. And he is going to do a sermon today on the attitude of gratitude, and he also has a little something to say about the Goodrich family as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dane.
Thank you, Marty. Do you mind passing out? And it can be
Sure.
anytime. Okay. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I've got something to be thankful for. Everything's going my way. You can see why I'm practicing law and not singing, right? A singer, so. We're not in Oklahoma, and we're not in Dorothy's, Kansas. We're in Indiana, and we're in Winchester. What a great community. And it's nice to be among so many friends. If I started recognizing everyone in the congregation, it would take a lot of time because I think I'd recognize everyone in the congregation. So anyhow, I appreciate, Marty, you inviting me to speak this morning. I'm going to read some biblical passages. And the first is Thessalonians. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Jesus Christ. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. That was in Acts. Corinthians 15:10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. And then the last verse I'll read is from Ephesians. If I have not stopped giving thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers, I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people. My vision has just really gotten worse. I was at the BVM last year, and I had to go through the test, the eye exam, and the lady behind, she was really busy doing other things, and she said, Mr. Starbuck, read line 2. And I looked at it, and I couldn't see anything. So I started, I didn't think she was paying attention, so I said, 3ZVM289. And she looked at me, and she says, Mr. Starbuck, there are no numbers in that line. So I got to the point, I think it's as a result of looking at a computer screen from 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening. I have to have glasses, and I have to take them on and off, depending on the distance. I think maybe some of you here may know what that's like. So I apologize if it's... I want to thank Marty for including me and inviting me. I think Peter Menzel, do any of you remember when Peter was here back in April or May? The Mustache Man, yes. Peter is a colleague of mine. Peter is a fellow at Liberty Fund, and he has become a good friend. I know of Allison and Marty. The last time I was here to speak was in October 2001 when the book came out on the Goodrich family, and there were about 125 people here, and I sold 92 books that night. I remember that because I never sold that many books ever again. So that was really special. Betty Terry and Mariana Reed and Ann Goodrich and Mrs. Barker. I'm so pleased that JB could be here this morning because I am going to talk a great deal about his family and tie it in with the church and tie it into my talk on gratefulness. I wanted to share a couple stories with you. Actually, there are a couple jokes. I figure if anyone asks you, how did Dane do in his sermon, you may say, well, I'm not sure that the sermon was very good, but he told a few good jokes. So the first one, a young boy walks into his house after he had been at school with his report card behind his back, and he walks into the house, and his father's sitting reading the paper. And he said, Dad, do you know how you can always be proud of me? Lower your expectations. Cindy said to her friend Janice, did you hear about the guy who fell into the airport baggage carousel? Janice said, no. Did he get knocked out? Cindy responded, yes, but he came around slowly. Now, I know we have a couple attorneys here, Meeks and Tom. I don't know anyone else, but I thought I would share with you an attorney joke. Now, this amnesia that you have, said the attorney to the witness, does it affect your memory at all? Oh, yes, said the witness. Well, how does it affect your memory? I forget things. The attorney responded, you forget, really? Well, can you give me an example of something you forgot? Now, doctor, is it true? This is an attorney or a doctor on the stand. Is it true? Isn't it true that when a person dies in his sleep, he doesn't know about it until the next morning? The doctor said to the lawyer, did you actually pass the bar exam? Now, I have done some research locally, and I'm glad that Suzanne could be here. Winchester has a population of about 5,000, right? But Fountain Park Cemetery has 10,000 occupied burial plots. Therefore, if you reside in Winchester, you have a 2/3 chance of being dead. Aren't you glad you invited me here this morning? Now, according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a sermon is a talk on a religious or moral subject, especially one given during a church service based on a passage from the Bible. This will be more of a talk than a sermon, but I do hope to tie it in at the end. I think they're interwoven. I enjoyed reading the centennial history of the Presbyterian Church that Marianna wrote back in 1982 when the church celebrated its 100th anniversary. What I was surprised is with Marianne's history was how much she spent about writing about the physical building, about the various buildings that had existed before and how this building was built. And there's not a lot of religious or theological history about the church. I say this not as a criticism, but to think it was an interesting thing that she did. The physical church, as we all know, is extremely important. Traditionally, it was the location of where baptisms and marriages and funerals and women's and men's Bible studies, bazaars, the local meeting place for families to come to. I say that because I'm going to talk at length about the Goodrich family and how it ties into that. Those of you who know a little bit about the history know that there were the original 5 Goodrich brothers who were born during and shortly after the American Civil War. Percy, who was president of the grain elevator here, he was chairman. He was the chairman of Goodrich Brothers, and he was also superintendent of the Presbyterian Church. Ed was president of Randolph County Bank from 1918 to 1953. He was the treasurer, and James, Governor Goodrich, taught a men's Bible study group here for 25 years. Despite being extremely wealthy, they did not live ostentatious lives. So a good friend of mine, a Catholic, said, Dane, if you are going to cheat on your taxes, it is best to be a Presbyterian because no one would know based upon your lifestyle that you are rich. I thought that was... About a month ago, I was invited to speak at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. It was a very nice luncheon. It's now called Newfields. And the reason they asked me is because Enid Goodrich, there were the 5 Goodrich brothers, and Governor Goodrich had a son, Pierre. And Pierre was probably the wealthiest man in Indiana when he passed away. His wife, when she passed away in 1996, she had left a little over $45 million to the Indianapolis Museum of Art $45 million to the Children's Museum, $80 million to Liberty Fund, and smaller amounts to Conner Prairie Midwest Eye Center. But it was interesting. The Indianapolis Museum of Art said, we don't know anything about her. We don't know why she left the money. Would you come and talk about her? They had their legacy group, people that had pledged. So I said I would be glad to do it. And how I'm going to approach talking this morning about gratitude is I'm going to use the case method. Now, because Tom and Meeks went to law school, they'll know what the case method is. The case method is where you actually discuss legal cases as opposed to teaching abstract legal concepts. The case method was established in 1871 at Harvard Law School by the dean, Christopher Langdell, and it became in vogue in the latter part of the 19th century. So what you do is you back into talking about principles through talking about a specific case. And I'm going to talk to you about gratitude through the story about how I got connected with the Goodrich family and what that has done about getting me reconnected with Winchester. So in 1974, I was going into my senior year of high school, and I started to work at the People's Loan and Trust Bank, and I also was the groundskeeper for the governor's mansion, where Marty and Allison live now. And so I learned a little bit about the Goodrich family, but not much. And so I went off to college, and Pierre Goodrich had died 9 months earlier in 1973, and I left, and it wasn't until 1989, 14 years later, I was working for Senator Coates, Dan Coates in Washington, D.C., and I was the legislative assistant for him on the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee. It was a fascinating experience. Ted Kennedy was chairman, Orrin Hatch was the ranking minority member, Nancy Kassebaum, Paul Simon of Illinois, Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, Barbara McCloskey, it was Tom Harkin. It was just a fascinating committee to work on. And so I drafted legislation. I returned to Indiana many times. I was also going to law school at night at Georgetown Law School and was on the law review. So I was just I was frantic, putting in 78 hours a week, working during the day, going to law school at night, and working on law review on weekends. But the most interesting thing happened to me while I was in Washington was none of that. It was an article I had read in the Indiana Magazine of History, and it was on Governor Goodrich. It was the cover story of the March 1989 issue. And it just happened, chance. It was something that changed my life. I picked up the magazine, not knowing who was on the cover. The faces, you couldn't recognize it. And I started reading about Governor Goodrich and about 4 trips that he had made to the Soviet Union. By a sign of hands, do any of you know about Governor Goodrich going to the Soviet Union? JB does. Yeah, Marty. Okay. So Governor Goodrich was asked by Herbert Hoover and Warren Harding was then president, if he would go over to the Soviet Union. And because there was a terrible Russian famine, somewhere between 20 and 30 million peasants were dying in the Volga region. But we weren't sure if it was a ploy, if it actually was happening, or if this was some way that the Soviets were trying to raise money. So they, Warren Harding, Charles Evan Hughes, who was then Secretary of State, Herbert Hoover, who was then Secretary of Commerce, invited Governor Goodrich to come to the White House. He did that on September 23rd, 1921. And they asked him if he would go over to the Soviet Union to investigate the famine, because Hoover was then known as the great humanitarian. Before Hoover was ever president, I don't know if you know this or not, he was known worldwide as being the head of the humanitarian efforts in Europe, in Asia, and so forth. So Governor Goodrich left a few weeks later with Cora. Cora ended up going to, I think she spent time in France when he was in the Soviet Union. And there Governor Goodrich met with Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, and all the higher Soviet leaders. And he ended up coming back, meeting with the president and Hoover and Charles Evan Hughes. He testified before Congress in December 1920, and as a result, Congress appropriated $20 million. In about 6 months, 50 ships left U.S. ports to take grain to the Soviet Union. It was one of the tremendous, one of the greatest humanitarian efforts, certainly of the 20th century, if not of all time. 11 million Russians were being fed every day, and it's estimated that somewhere around 20 million, their lives were saved. So anyhow, I read this article, and I said, this is really interesting. I'm from Winchester. I didn't know this. I'd worked as a groundskeeper. And so in 1991, when I came back to Indiana, I took the bar exam, and I had a week before I started a clerkship with a federal judge in Fort Wayne. I drove to West Branch, Iowa, which is where President Herbert Hoover's presidential library is at. In fact, I'm going back on Friday. And what happened is I researched for several days not only this famine, but the Goodrich family. It was one of the most remarkable stories I had ever come across. And I said, why didn't I know this? Why didn't anyone tell me? And so as a result of that initial trip, over the next 30 years, go from 1991 up to today, I've traveled to 42 cities or towns, going to universities, college libraries, foundations, interviewing people. I've interviewed 160 people about the Goodrich family. I'm currently working on a History of Liberty Fund, which Pierre founded and which I'm on the board of trustees of. And what it did, it gave me a tremendous appreciation for our local town of Winchester. Because not only did I learn about Winchester, I learned about some other incredible people. And this is where I'm going with this. Of the people I learned about, our small community, including Union City at times, but we produced 2 men who ran for President of the United States, a U.S. Senate Majority Leader, 2 Indiana governors, 3 other men who ran for governor, 2 of whom won their party's nomination, 4 U.S. congressmen, 3 Indiana Secretary of States, a Chief Justice of the Federal Court of Claims in Washington, D.C., 2 justices of the Indiana Supreme Court, including a Chief Justice, 3 judges of the Indiana Court of Appeals, including a Chief Judge, 2 U.S. ambassadors to Mexico. If you include local villages and towns, such as Ridgeville and Saratoga, farmland, we're also talking about the first ambassador to Israel, a superintendent of the Indiana Department of Education, an internationally recognized economist and president of the American Economic Association, the founder and first president of the Mathematical Association of America, a nationally recognized musician, band, and orchestra conductor, an internationally recognized astronomer who was a member of the International Astronomical Union in Paris, the president of the University of Iowa, who later became president of the Carnegie Foundation. The list just goes on and on of people from this small community who went on and did great things, some of whom are buried out at Fountain Park Cemetery. So it gave me much greater appreciation. So if you remember, maybe you don't remember, 4 years ago, Randolph County and Winchester recognized or celebrated its bicentennial, its 200th anniversary, and the plaza on the south side of the courthouse square was there. And Errol Clem and the Bicentennial Committee asked if I would write the plaques that are located there, write the verbiage for the plaques that are located on the south side of the courthouse. Since that time, something that I've been trying to do is to do more with Winchester history. And because through all this effort, if I try to think about what did I gain from it, it didn't enrich me. In fact, it probably did the other. I probably spent too much time working on this, but it enriched me in other ways. Some things that I'm working on right now is the Winchester Foundation is holding a series of conferences on small towns. In fact, we're going to have one on August 12th. Patty is going to attend, and Marty's going to attend. Last year, Missy attended. I'm helping Patty Konosinski. We're working on Volume 2 of Golden Graduates of Winchester High School. Patty, Lisa Jennings, and Tom Osborne and I are working on the WCH Honors Program night. Have any of you been out to Winchester on the end of the year where the honors program is given? We're trying to give some spunk to that evening of recognition. And then Suzanne, I promise you a website for the Fountain Park Cemetery will happen. And then we've been doing a lot of work with the museum, Randolph County Historical Museum. So my conclusion is this. I gained a lot of inspiration from doing local history, and these are my conclusions. We are not placed here on earth to operate on autopilot or just to live off the largesse that we've been handed. And you might say, what largesse? I never inherited $1 million. Well, no, neither did I. But we've been given something maybe more valuable, and that is an opportunity to live in America. The American dream is one of the great things that millions of people throughout the world aspire towards. So what is it that we owe past generations, and what is it do we owe future generations? And that may seem like a strange question. What can we possibly do to people who have predeceased us? And I think what we owe to them is to carry on the traditions that they gave to us. That is our responsibility, and it also allows us to give to the next generation. In my research about Randolph County, it's interesting. In 1830, there were only 4,000 people in Randolph County. And I looked at the census for 1830. Winchester had 75 people of 12 families in 1830. So from 1830 to 1860, the county grew from 4,000 to 20,000. So it grew 5 times, and that was known as the Great Quaker Migration. It wasn't just Quakers, it was also Presbyterians and Methodists and other denominations, Congregationalists and many others, but it was how the county expanded so greatly. The thing that I learned is, if you know anything about Quaker theology, I found it very interesting, and I think it fits our community very well, is the Quakers and Presbyterians, this is my analysis after having read theology of John Knox and Martin Luther and Calvin, is that in the Quaker tradition, they experience discernment through looking for what's known as the inner light. And this is where they contemplate and reflect, listening intently to an inner spirit. Quakers tend not to believe that an intermediary, such as a priest or a pastor, is needed to bridge the connection between the individual and God. Presbyterians seek this same discernment of God through reading and discussion. The thing that I find interesting about the Presbyterian tradition is how important in the past Sunday school has been, and how much important it is to read both the Bible and biblical commentaries. So, I want to read a quote. I don't know if you know this man or not. His name is David McCullough. If you ever watched the PBS show, The American Experience, he's the narrator. He's also the biographer of John Adams and Harry Truman. He has a very deep, resonant voice, and he's a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He says, so many people go through life thinking all that happened just around us just happened, that it didn't take initiative and imagination and effort, but it can be blown away, it can be discarded very rapidly, never ever to come back again. It's not just ignorant to be indifferent to history, it's rude. It is being ungrateful towards all those people who work so hard to give us what we have here in this nation. And we have to not only be custodians of that, we have to improve upon it. I think those last 5 words, we have to improve upon it, is what I would like to leave. So how do we go about and do that? Well, I think for us to experience gratitude, we need to understand what we're being appreciative or have gratitude for. And that does require the reading of history, talking to people who are older than we are, listening. It may require turning off electronic devices, which preoccupy our lives. I walk and run a lot where I live, and it seems like every person that I come across has an electronic device in their hands. They can't even walk. The other thing that I think that we have to be appreciative of is just to understand American history. And one example of this is since 1901, little known fact, about just shy of 1,000 Nobel Prize winners have been given out throughout the world since 1901. And of that number, 42% are from America. 42% of all Nobel Prize winners throughout the world have been awarded to Americans. We're 4% of the world's population. So if you're born in America, you were lucky. You got a 1/25th chance of being born. You were born here. Also interesting, 22% of Nobel Prize winners are Jewish. So the other thing is, I talk about reading. I talk about the importance of visiting local cemeteries and perhaps churches to get an understanding. And then to do something that you've never done before and to do it well. I think that is recognizing those who predeceased us. If you read anything in academic journals or more likely in mainstream magazines, there's a word that's written, that's a lot of articles have been written about in recent years. It's called mindfulness. We need to be more mindful. And that simply means, I think, reflective, contemplative, and I think we have an aversion to being alone by ourselves. We feel as though we have to fill every minute. And then when traveling, I did a biography on John Fisher. He was the former president, chairman of the board of Ball Corporation. And one of his sons said, and I never thought of that Dad and Mom didn't spend a lot of time with us during the year, but they always took us on family vacations during the summer. And whenever we always went to a nice place. And oftentimes his father, who was a pilot, flew them. And they went to Europe, and they went to South America and all over. And he said the one thing that Dad did was when we ever went to Cancun, we also went to the slums of Mexico City. Every time they experienced something really interesting and great, he wanted them to see how other people lived, because those young children, they had 7 children, would never have experienced that. So when I started doing the work on the Goodrich family, one thing that I realized, it wasn't just the Goodriches. Everyone came here as part of that great migration from the early part of the 1800s to the latter part of the 1800s, pretty much the same. They were all farmers. And the first generation were farmers, and the second generation were farmers, and the third generation started to becoming shop merchants. And then the next generation became lawyers and doctors and businessmen and bankers. And it was interesting, if you look at the history of the Presbyterian Church, and I mentioned these names, that progression very much fits every one of them. Whether or not we're talking about the Jakeways, Marilyn, there you are. Marilyn, the Jakeways, the Commons, the Paynes, the Neffs, the Thompsons, the Wards, the Mormons, the Maceys, the Litchards. Their stories are pretty much all the same. Now, the Goodriches became the richest and the best known, but that was kind of the story of America, and that's why I became so intrigued in doing the research on this one family. So I will close trying to tie this together to Scripture. According to Ephesians 5:1-2, imitation is the highest form of flattery, and it says, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling aroma." Within these 2 verses, wrote the commentary, there are 2 twin commands. And first is to mimic God, to mimic or mime. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Walk in love as Christ did for you. And then to go on, in other words, don't try to flatter God, just try to imitate him. Just as our parents and grandparents did for us, we should do for others, to exercise our fullest potential and to show human flourishing to the fullest. I asked Marty to pass out that pamphlet on the history of the Winchester Foundation. We celebrated the 75th anniversary last November. Meeks is on the board of trustees and has rejoined us. And it's really quite interesting. I think this goes back to the Presbyterian roots of human flourishing. What is it to live a full life? And that is human flourishing. How best, if you just read the mission on the front page, to study the arts, the humanities. I thought it was interesting. Pierre wanted to study thrift. What foundation in the world studies thrift? But it was his understanding of what creates a fruitful, flourishing society. And it fits so much into our notion that we first have to start, in order to do that, to have gratitude. With that, I've ended. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Allison.